Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. And the topic for this video is to get more detailed into this idea of stroke volume. So we just defined stroke volume as a factor of cardiac output. And we can talk about stroke volume as the amount of blood ejected in that cardiac cycle during ventricular ejection. And another way of talking about stroke volume is with this sort of equation where we talk about the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. And if you go back to your cardiac cycle notes, you'll see we talked about both in diastolic volume and in systolic volume during that presentation. We can abbreviate the end diastolic volume as ADV, and so that's very often what we'll do. And we can abbreviate the end systolic volume as ESV. Now, when we talk about the end diastolic volume or the EDV, we also talked about this as our preload. And so this is talking about the amount of blood in the ventricle let's see, the end diastolic means at the end of diastole. So I'm gonna write here when relaxation ends, which is diastole. And actually we're seeing the systole starting and contraction starts, meaning we've closed off the AV valves. So end diastolic volume is named because ventricular diastole has ended. Ventricular systole has started. And remember, it's the initial contraction of that ventricle that's pushing the blood back up toward the atria that actually closes off those tricuspid and bicuspid or AV valves. Now, remember, we're getting this amount of blood kind of in two ways. So we get the passive filling that's happening when the heart is at rest. And we see that 70 to 80% of this total volume is coming during this passive filling time. And then we talked about, this book calls it the atrial kick. That's the first time I've heard this expression. I really like it. The atrial kick. So when the atria contract and push that final 20 to 30% of the blood into the ventricle. So this is like the source of our EDV. Okay. When we talk about the end systolic volume, what we're seeing here in the ESV is the amount of blood left over after contraction. So at this point in a cardiac cycle, remember the ventricles stop contracting. The ventricle stops pushing blood out through the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And so because there's no longer this push of the blood out, we see the blood like falling back towards the heart. And remember that closes the semilunar valves. So what we see here is that the heart is a very effective, very good pump. Some hearts are better pumps than others. And what we're going to see is that we have this push of blood out, that ventricular ejection, but not every drippy drop of blood is going to actually leave those chambers. So there's going to be some blood that remains, and the blood that remains in the heart is described as the ESV. So here, one kind of example that I like to do is to have a dry, crispy sponge, right? And so let's imagine I've got a bowl of water, and let's imagine we're getting that passive filling. So the heart is relaxed and we see that 70 to 80% of the blood being soaked up by our sponge, meaning moving from the atria into the ventricle. My sponge is so crusty, it has taken a while to take up some of that fluid. So I want to sort of represent that 70 to 80%. So I'm trying to get it up kind of to that level. Here we're sort of seeing, maybe, yeah. We're seeing like the majority of the blood that's entering into the ventricle is happening passively. And then let's say we have the atrial systole. So we get that contraction of the atria, and that's giving us that atrial kick. And so now we're getting like all of the blood that we can possibly get into the ventricle is entering the ventricle. And so now you can see like it's even dripping a little bit, like my ventricle's full, right? Okay, and then we're gonna have that. So the amount of blood that my sponge can soak up, the amount of blood that's actually in the ventricle to start is the EDV or the preload, right? So this is like our starting amount of blood, right? And then let's say we get the ventricle contracting. The ventricles contract and initially close the AV valve, and then the ventricles keep contracting and we get that ventricular ejection. So let me go ahead and squeeze. Remember, our heart has that kind of plateau, so it's going to do like a squeeze and hold. Squeeze and hold. And so this blood that I was able to pump out of my heart would be my stroke volume. This is the amount of blood that was ejected, but I'm not sure how well it translates on the video, but my sponge is still wet. You guys know this though, right? Y'all have worked with the Kenshin sponge before, and you know that you can squeeze it out and it's no longer dripping, but it's still damp. It's still got moisture. So however much fluid is left over in my sponge, however much fluid is left over in my ventricle at the end of that ventricular systole is my ESV. So this is what's remaining. Now, if I did this again, if I soaked up some more water in my sponge, right? And I actually, now my bowl's empty. I've got my starting fluid, that's my EDV. And let's say like I'm kind of a lousy heart and I just squeeze a little bit. And so now I have a whole lot of blood, a whole lot of fluid left over in my heart. And so that's an ESV, whatever's left over. So what we're going to see is one of the factors that affects your stroke volume is your contractility of your heart, meaning how effective is it at squeezing out all of that blood. So what we're going to see is we want a high EDV and we want a low ESV. Okay, so let's try to say that again. Ideally, we have a high stroke volume. That means we're getting a lot of blood pumped through our body, right? We're pumping a lot of blood with each one of those cardiac cycles, with each one of those heartbeats, right? And in order to get a nice high stroke volume, you would ideally have a higher EDV, and then you would have a lower ESV. So in order to have a high stroke volume, you want a lot of blood to start with. That's your EDV as your starting volume. Let's say that. That's a pretty nice summary. And then your ESV, remember, is your leftover in the heart. And so you want very little bit that's left over. Let's just real basically go through some things that will affect stroke volume, and we'll end our video because it's going a little long, and then we'll pick up on some specific details. So when we talk about the stroke volume, things that affect stroke volume would be heart size, individual condition. So that might be the conditions of the body. That might be like if you're exercising or at rest. The sex of the body can determine or make the differences in the stroke volume. A lot of times that has to do with body size and hormones. Contractility. That's talking about how effective is the heart at squeezing out that blood. Remember, we demonstrated that with the sponge. The preload, which is actually really another way of talking about the EDV, and we're gonna define that a little bit more detailed here as we go through. What's described as the afterload, and we'll describe this also. This is like resistance of getting the blood leaving the heart and out through the body. Afterload is like the resistance. How hard is it to get the blood out of the heart and through the body? Filling time. We're going to add in this detail here, but essentially remember we're talking about majority of your EDV is moving. The majority of that blood is entering into the ventricle passively. So this is a factor of your heart rate. Filling time is a factor of your heart rate. And then what we can talk about as venous return. And this is talking about bringing blood back from the veins toward the heart. So how effective are you at getting blood from your veins back to the heart? All right, let's stop here and pick up looking at some more specific details of stroke volume. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.